Glad to be here this morning and speak to you all about a topic very near and dear to my heart. I just realized that our formal relationship began with this church 15 years ago. Where did that number come from? That's when we officially came on board with the Christian and Missionary Alliance as international workers on our way to Mongolia. And you all helped to send us there by your giving to the Great Commission Fund. The year prior to that, we worked at our home church in New Mexico, and one of my jobs in that year, between our Pueblo Indian ministry and our service in Mongolia, was to establish small groups in that church. Isn't it funny how sometimes something you do, you end up doing again at a later time? God works that way. And my principal passage for this morning is the New Testament. So I won't read the whole thing. And the content of my message, it'll be over in about 2 minutes here. It's this welcome message from Tim and Shauna. Shauna wrote it, I think, describing their experience with small group ministries. Now, I do have more than that, but please read that when you have a chance. So let me find my spot here. So based on the title of this message, The Large Significance of Small Togetherness, we could think of this day somewhat as Community Group Recruitment Sunday or Sign Up Sunday. And I have several good reasons for wanting to talk about this topic. First, it is part of my job here at CMA Church. And in addition to the 15 years that we began that missionary and sending church relationship, now we are coming upon 6 months of having come on staff at the church. How time flies. And it is one of my job description areas to work to develop small group ministries here at our church. And I had the privilege and the challenge of developing these small group ministries before, as I mentioned, at our previous home church in Los Alamos, New Mexico. And also, during our work in Mongolia, our overseas ministry work, we developed a number of small group type ministries, support groups for alcohol and other addiction and abuse recovery ministries, support groups including for battered and abused women, for Christian singles, women's groups, a married couples group, and a number of these small togetherness, small group type ministries. In fact, most of the churches we worked with in Mongolia were small enough that they qualified in this category as small togetherness churches. So we've also had the privilege of being part of a small group at various times. A small group like the ones that we call community groups here, kind of a closer church family within the church family, and our testimony would be very similar to the Smiths or to what Corey shared. Thank you, Corey, for that testimony as well. So in addition to bringing this experience, I have a tremendous passion for small group ministries, and I believe in them as a wonderful means of pursuing and capturing more of the biblical essence of the church that our large togetherness on its own cannot provide in the way that small togetherness can. Involvement in a small group can add a whole new dimension to the experience of the Christian life. And using this idea of dimension, I can give you an analogy that highlights the unique nature of the small group. Not a perfect one, but a useful one. The large togetherness life of the church gives much height and width to our Christian experience. So it's like a beautiful framed picture of a delicious piece of fruit, if you will. Small togetherness, small group experiences take that picture and bring it to life, adding that third dimension of depth. And it becomes no longer an inaccessible object in a picture, the kind of depth of fellowship that God intends and provides for us to have in the church. And it becomes something we can hold in our hand and smell and taste. A much richer, deeper experience. Or you could think of large togetherness as, here's my toolbox here. I don't use props very often, but it can be fun. Here's my large togetherness. This is called the Fat Max demolition tool, okay? And I can do about 4 things with this. I can get a lot of big jobs done, a few big jobs done with this. And here's my small togetherness. This is my multi-tool. And it's got lots of great little tools on here that I can fix. Lots of small, intricate things with, and I probably have 8 to 10 tools on here that I can get many different things done on a smaller level. So where this large Fat Max demolition tool, or you could call it a construction tool if you prefer, does a few kinds of heavy work on kind of the large frame of our lives. And whereas that small togetherness, like that multi-tool, for many small, intricate jobs on the interior of our lives. And when I was trying to think of an analogy, the first one I had was a machete versus a scalpel. But I didn't know that bringing large, sharp objects to church on Sunday morning would be the best idea. The Fat Max is probably pushing the limit here. So this is not to diminish the importance of large togetherness, like what we're experiencing here this morning. However, a problem with our cultural model of doing church this big is that we have made it so big that it loses some of the qualities of the small church, the experience of the church that is only found in significant measure in smaller forms of togetherness. So this is just a logical conclusion that we could draw. The small togetherness seeks to recapture what might be lost by taking our whole and breaking it into smaller pieces. And it places emphasis on that depth that we might be lacking in the large togetherness life of the church. So breaking it into smaller pieces that provide for deeper relational connection and the depth of fellowship that God has made possible and that facilitates the kind of growth and health that He desires, a depth that is lost to some level once you exceed a certain size in large togetherness. In more abstract terms, this is what our community groups are designed to do. In more concrete terms, community groups provide multiple centers for discipleship, service, leadership development, and outreach, as well as opportunities for deeper relational connections. All of this leading to greater health and growth for individuals and the church. Or stated in more grandiose terms, community groups can provide us with greater momentum towards fulfilling, as individuals and the church, the desire of God for our health and growth, as described in many places in the New Testament, for example, in Ephesians 4:13, until we all attain to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to a mature man, to the measure of the stature which belongs to the fullness of Christ. Because our community groups have this kind of potential, it is my desire to develop our community groups with two goals in mind. One, to ensure that existing groups are biblically strong and healthy. And two, to establish more groups so that conceivably every person in this church, every person who's a member of this church can have a place not only in our church as a whole, but in a community group as well. And as this happens, as we trust God for this impossibility to happen, I would invite every member to avail themselves of this opportunity. I would not say that our development of community groups is so much intended to fix something that's broken or that's wrong in our church, but I would encourage us all to see it as an opportunity that might be missed and that's before us to seize. So, however, this leaves us with the strategic need to develop more community groups. At this time, given the number of our community groups and their stage of development, this opportunity really does not currently exist in our church. If this morning everyone raised their hand and said, I want to sign up for a community group, I want to join one, we would not have a place in one for all of you. We simply don't have enough of them and not enough with space to receive new members. And granted, the idea to launch them began a number of months ago in response to some of the life of our church that was being lost and the need to recoup and reclaim some togetherness life in our church. And that was wonderful. And we want to build on that. This opportunity is a lost opportunity for us if we do not invest ourselves in a united effort of building on what was started and expanding through a concerted effort of establishing more of these community groups within our church. And this is not to say that we don't have lots of other forms of small togetherness taking place, or that they're unimportant. And I'm thankful for all of you who are involved in Bible studies and prayer meetings and fellowship groups, meetings in the park, whatever you're doing to get groups together meeting. Sunday evening events like tonight, more of a small togetherness type event. All kinds of things that are going on that serve their purpose in meeting the need of the church for small togetherness. Good things. So not to say that there's anything wrong with any of those. But our community groups represent a unique opportunity. They're a unique type of small group that doesn't focus on just one function or two, maybe three, or a select number of functions of the church, but on seeking to fulfill all the functions of the church. As such, I call them microcosm groups, or a smaller version of the whole, smaller versions of the larger church, or the church within the church, small groups. And the importance of small togetherness and that type of small togetherness represented in community groups becomes clear to us when we understand the biblical structure and biblical functions of the church. So we could call this Community Group Recruitment Sunday, or also, I would say, the purpose for this message is to put a biblical foundation under what we're trying to do. Because anything we do in this church needs to have biblical grounding. A good place to begin is the beginning of the church. In Acts chapter 1 and 2, we get a picture of both the essential structure and the functions of the church. In terms of structure, we find in these chapters one obvious characteristic. Maybe it might miss us because it's so obvious, or we might miss it. And let me synthesize it from a number of verses from these first two chapters of Acts. Gathering them together. So when they had come together, continually devoting themselves to, A gathering of 120 persons was there together. They were all together in one place, day by day, continuing with one mind in the temple and breaking bread from house to house, taking their meals together. So do you see a theme emerging here? In these verses describing the church, the word together occurs 5 times. The fundamental characteristic of church structure that emerges from this passage is simply this: people and the togetherness of people. We also observe 2 things about this togetherness. First, we find the characteristic of continually and continuing. It was a consistent, frequent togetherness. Secondly, we find the expression of both large and small togetherness, being all together in the large public spaces of the temple and being together in smaller private groups from house to house. Of course, we find these same elements in the life and the ministry of Jesus. Jesus was often ministering. He ministered continuously, continually, consistently, frequently, often with large crowds of people, sometimes smaller crowds. He ministered with a group of 70, a group of 12, down to a group of 3. And the reason he did that was because he could accomplish different ministry goals and purposes with different sizes of groups of people. He couldn't do the same with the 70 that he could do with the 12, and he couldn't do the same with the 12 that he could do with the 3, because of the nature and the dynamics of human relational connection and interaction. So we can safely conclude that togetherness on both levels, in both forms, both large and small, are part of the essential structure of the church. As such, they are important for the health and growth of individual believers and the church as a whole. And this makes tremendous sense when we consider that both forms of togetherness are needed for fulfilling the biblical functions of the church, which we see from this same passage. In particular, Acts chapter 2, which provides us with a descriptive list of the essential functions of the church, including devotion to prayer, preaching the gospel and adding new members, the apostles' teaching or Bible study, praise and worship, sharing of lives, caring for one another, and meeting spiritual and material needs one to another, and observing the Lord's Supper and baptism. So from many other prescriptive passages, that's why I say my passage today is the whole New Testament, we get many prescriptive, assigned, commanded, instructed forms of functions of the church that we're to be going after and seeking to fulfill as a church. Keeping one another strong in faith, protecting one another from going astray, holding one another accountable and restoring when straying, encouraging one another and teaching and admonishing one another in a spirit of humility and thankfulness. Just from a few passages in Hebrews, Galatians, Matthew, and Colossians. And being equipped through gifted leaders for the work of the ministry, and together striving towards spiritual maturity and fullness in Christ. We see that in Ephesians 4:11-16, and in 1 Peter 4:10, all members using their gifts to serve one another. We see again that these functions are fulfilled through both large and small togetherness, so that one could argue this, and here I'm making the case for my assertions in my introduction. Some of these functions may be enhanced by large public togetherness. However, all of them can be accomplished through, and some of them to an extent only through, small togetherness. You could almost say we could do away with a church this size and still live the Christian life. We don't have to be gathering this big to do church. We happen to choose this as a cultural model. And there are ways that this produces glory for God that a small church can't, and that gets things done with resources and a combining of gifting that a small church may miss out on. But if we miss out on small togetherness, we may fail to accomplish things that large togetherness cannot fulfill, and to the level that only small togetherness can fulfill. So with this understanding of the large significance of small togetherness, and given the opportunity that community groups present to us to capture more of the biblical essence of the church and avoid losing some of it in our largeness, what is required of us to seize the opportunity? What are the challenges that we face? And I'll begin with the more logistical and move towards the deeper spiritual challenges. The first is related to the nature of these groups that I've described as microcosm groups, or church within a church small groups. With this come some of the challenges of planting churches. This process we are in is like planting churches within a church. Essential to planting churches is biblically qualified shepherding leadership. Without this, members of the church or the group have no one to lead them, to protect them from false teaching, from sin, from conflict, the things that beset the church. Also, a church needs a critical mass of members, without which the leaders have no one to lead, and thus none to prepare for the work of the ministry of the church. Which means if we want to multiply community groups, we must recruit and mobilize, one, all of our biblically qualified leadership, which is our limiting factor. We can only produce as many community groups in this church as we have biblically qualified leaders to lead. To the extent possible, it is my desire and invitation to all of those leaders to consider leading a community group, recognizing that not all of you may be able to. So we must mobilize also, secondly, the members of our body to participate in community groups. And I could have put mind maps and charts and figures up here, but that's not necessary for this message, maybe a later training or a message for leaders. But essentially what we'd like to see is a second layer of togetherness that spans the entire width of our church. That instead of one big, large foundation block, consists of smaller blocks. And so that would be the ideal. As much of that as we can accomplish, the better. So this will require, however, significant sacrifice and commitment from all of us. Because community groups are built out of us, they won't happen without our commitment and sacrificial involvement. And it's at this point that I wish it would work for me, whose job it is to develop these ministries in our church. The way it appeared to work for Jesus, where he just pointed at someone and said, you lead this group, you join this group, right? When he got his disciples together. It doesn't work that way all the time, does it? So as I extend invitations, I'm trusting that Jesus will be doing that through his Holy Spirit, and that I won't have to. The second challenge we face resides in the nature of the thing we are trying to make more of as we seek to plant churches within our church. And that is this thing that we've been calling togetherness. So, the nature of biblical togetherness is in itself a challenge. This is our bar, biblical togetherness, and it's a high bar. This is not a common togetherness. This is not merely a country club, social gathering togetherness. Rather, it is a togetherness defined more in terms like these. Biblical togetherness is a continual, frequent, increasing, selfless, sacrificial, self-giving, interdependent, intimate, sharing of all things with one another togetherness. Are we there yet? Of course, all of us parents who've had kids in the car on a trip, right? Are we there yet? Right? Some of us maybe don't want to get to that destination because we have things in our lives that keep us from even wanting to open up like our lives like that. Now, I know even there's natural barriers in us, like us men. It sounds a lot like talking about feelings or something, right? So how appealing is that, right? We need to trust that God's going to work that out for us. And, it is a high bar for a reason, because we live in a hostile, alien world that is against us. We have an enemy within that can destroy us. And we need each other to survive here. Whether we know it or believe it or not, Christ and His power are at work for us, through us, one to another. It is for this reason that we are commanded to not forsake the assembling together. And it lists a host of dangers that are there if we do not. And the reason for the assembling together, to protect us, for our good, for our growth. And given our understanding of the biblical structure and functions of the church that we just saw, we can conclude that we ought not forsake the assembling together in any of its biblical dimensions, large and small, wide and deep. And this brings us to our final challenge, the greatest challenge residing in the very nature of the church, which is required for it to be the church. This challenge has to do with the very nature of the church. Again, us. We, the people who form the church. The nature of the church is that it is built of people. We, the people. So the fundamental nature of the church being that the church is not made of bricks and boards, but of people. The church does not exist without us, and apart from us and us doing the gathering, there is no church, and there is no togetherness, large or small. We, flawed and sinful people, are our own essential building blocks. It's not that we are working with perfect materials. We are working with substandard, flawed materials. What could go wrong when flawed, sinful people are involved? The obstacles residing in us are many. Some are practical and unavoidable. I just mentioned one. I'm a guy. It took me a lot of work in my life to get used to talking about and opening up with my life to others. Not that that's only a problem for men, but in my experience working with men, it has been an issue. For them to sense the relevance and feel safe in doing that because of what it might mean in cost to their masculinity. So some of it has to do with our personality makeup and orientation, or the circumstances of the world we live in which we find ourselves. For some of us, Again, it's difficult to share our lives with others, and we need to understand that our goal is for our community groups to be safe places for being who we are. If you attend a community group and you want to be silent the whole time, you're free to do so. And you will get out of it what you put into it. But they are safe places for being who we are without obligation or pressure to share things we're not comfortable with. There need to be rules for privacy and protection of people's personal information so that what happens in the community group stays in the community group. And that's part of my job, to train leaders how to create community groups that are safe places with rules for that kind of thing. And I will say this was one of the biggest adjustments for me in my early years as a Christian. I had perfected the art of avoiding togetherness in my young life with people and made a life goal of isolation. My idea of the perfect small group was me, myself, and I, a group of 3. And the areas I needed to grow in the most when I became a Christian, began to learn what God's will was for my life and how He wanted to grow me, was learning to be part of a faith community, a real, vital, meaningful part of the church community, and learning to share my life with other people, to be used of God in the lives of others as He was using theirs and mine. So we all need to be prepared to be stretched, to grow, but also to rest secure that our personal wishes and privacy will be respected and protected as we try to step out into more meaningful connectivity and relationships and go deeper in that. In terms of the world we live in and the effect it has on us, I'll just say this. Busyness is a problem for a lot of us. It's a problem for me and my family. Some of my busyness problem is my own problem. Some of it comes from the nature of the culture in which we live, which bombards us with a tyranny of good opportunities that are hard to say no to, and that we have the means to avail ourselves of. So we may have 1,000 good opportunities, but God only wants us to be taking advantage of 999 of those. So I need to be asking Him, Lord, what among the good opportunities you have laid before me, which ones do you want me to make an opportunity for myself, and which do you want me to pass on? So, being busy is not necessarily a problem. Motivated people are busy people. And we all want to be motivated people, right? But making this happen will require some of us to find more margin in our lives so that we can prioritize involvement in our community group as a vital part of meaningful involvement. So we need to trust God that as we commit to Him and seek after His priorities, that He will provide the margin we need. And He will do what He specializes in, one of the many things, turning any losses we endure for Him into gains for us and for others. Added to these challenges is the deeper, darker challenge of the sin that hinders. Our spirit may be willing, but our flesh is weak. We struggle to keep our spiritual priorities in order. We tend to allow the weeds and thorns to grow up around us. We don't cut them back and pull them up like we should. The parable of the soils lists some of these weeds by species and kind. The pursuit of pleasures, the cares and worries of this life, the deceitfulness of wealth, and the desire for other things. These take root in our lives and grow up and choke us, making us unfruitful. So may God speak to our hearts today about some of these weeds and trust Him to do some of the whacking away of those weeds and pulling up that we might need to be doing. And as I ask all of us to confront these challenges, and as I invite all of us to seek what the Lord would desire of us for involvement in community groups, I can offer these general suggestions in closing here. Assign a new priority to community groups based on this biblical understanding of the large significance of small togetherness. See them as vital, not merely beneficial. In light of the large significance of small togetherness and the unique opportunity community groups represent for health and growth, pray and ask God how He wants you to be involved. And let's respect one another's decisions regarding involvement in community groups. We realize that though these community groups do have potential value for everyone, involvement or some certain level of involvement may not be possible or the same for all of us. And what God is asking of some of us may not be the same as what He's asking of others. So with this invitation and an appeal to unity and respect, let us seek the Lord together in this, starting with the plan that's before us. The plan is to launch new groups starting from next Sunday. And here are some next steps you can take. The idea is to start with the new sermon series in Mark that will begin next Sunday. We have a number of groups that will be starting and resuming. There will be others starting and resuming later towards spring and summer. But we want to take advantage of this moment, starting in a new sermon series. And the groups, it's suggested that the groups follow that as their Bible study content for their groups. And so be looking to the website for a list of these groups that you can go and join. You can sign up for involvement, and we will make sure that we find a home for you in those. Do this soon so that we can direct you to one of our open community groups. Our main mechanism for this being the church website, but you can always come to me too. Tell me you're interested. You can indicate on the Connect card that you're interested in community groups, and we'll make sure that we get you plugged in to community groups. So some next steps. Sign up for involvement in community groups. Identify any sinful weeds that have grown up in your life and ask God to help you remove them. Identify any of the harmless clutter, maybe not sinful, but busyness clutter in your life, and clear out some to create more margin for church involvement. Let me pray. Father, we give this project to you. Help us to know our place in it that you want for us. Help us to put your church in its right place in our lives, that it would not be merely fit around our lives, but that it would be at the center of our lives. This thing your word calls the household of God, the church of the living God, the pillar and support of the truth, the one you loved and gave yourself up for. May we too have that love and give ourselves up for her. Show us what that means in each of our lives. Help us to cut back weeds and clear clutter from our lives that make us unfruitful, that hinder us from abiding in you and in submitting to you as Lord through vital, meaningful relation with the community of faith in which together we are united in you. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.